made it this far, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. We are supported by Projectile Warehouse, so if you guys could go over and check out their page, follow them on YouTube and all of the social medias, that would be fantastic.
Today, Steve Hurt from Outer Edge Projectiles joining us here on the podcast. Thanks heaps for coming along, mate. I really appreciate it.
I've been looking forward to it for ages.
Yeah, mate, that's an honour to hear that. So, so for our listeners, we've got Steve. Steve, you own and run Outer Edge Projectiles, which is an Australian owned and run projectile company.
Yep,
making monolithic projectiles.
I'm one of the major shareholders, but yeah,
Yep.
I'm the ballistician for the unit, and I do all the ballistic technical work. And I have business partners helping us out on the computerisation of the machinery, what have you. But yeah, it operates a tight little group, and it's works extremely well.
Yeah, nice. Well, maybe just give us a little bit of a background on how you decide, because I don't even know the answer myself. What got you into wanting to make your own projectiles, and then specifically why you guys have chosen to go the route of copper projectiles and monolithic. So we'll obviously deep dive into the benefits and things later on in the podcast or in another podcast, but just an overview of why you guys have gone the route that you have and how you decided to sort of get started.
Well, basically, I was the operations manager for the game unit in New South Wales, and it was all very new and fresh, and we were learning what does and doesn't work and how certain processes are undertaken, and was always up for review and modification. And the primary objective was to get volunteer hunters into pest animal management and reduction programs and regimes. And one of the major things that popped up was a very wide variety in standards, and that there were opportunities to lift those standards with training programs. And out of that came issues of lifting the standard of the individuals, but also some of the product choices were not really flash. And there came a time when I left that unit. I've gone, well, the training side of the equation is more limited opportunity, and I went down the path of product development because I was distinctly unhappy with product performance in the field, particularly for humane outcomes. And the one that I noticed was probably most important is that when it comes to humane outcomes and ballistic performance, the two most important things are the bullet and the barrel. And discovered that people aren't likely to change their barrel in a hurry. They've got what they've got. So the only adaptable alternative was to adapt the bullet to the existing program to produce the best outcomes. And I've spent the last 12 years studying the subject, basically 60 hours a week for 52 weeks of the year, trying to catch up to speed and work out all the details. And we now operate at a very sophisticated standard, but I can't believe how long and steep the curve has been.
And I bet you probably feel like you're forever learning as well. Like always still new things, new technology allowing you to dive deeper into what's going on with these bullets as we sling them into space. This black magic, as we call it when we throw them out there.
Well, it can be. And whilst the science basically drills down to very, very high standards, every now and then a surprise comes out of the woodwork you just weren't expecting, or somebody with less experience asks a really apparently simple question, and it sits you back in your seat and you go, I'm going to have to deal with that. And I'm not sure what the answer is right now.
Yeah. That's awesome. So I think a lot of people think of the copper projectile thing as a hunting only. I know that's how I've viewed it, just because of maybe my limited understanding. I viewed it as like, that's something you do when you're meat harvesting, and you don't want lead scattered through your meat that you're going to eat. But sort of meeting you over the last couple of days and talking with you, you're also an avid ELR shooter. You shoot a lot of long distance target stuff as well. You make target specific projectiles. So that was interesting for me to go, oh, okay, this monolithic thing isn't just for people wanting to meat harvest. It's people actually trying to find some gains in target shooting and stuff as well.
And it's basically three markets for the product. There's the military law enforcement side of the equation, which is probably outside of the context of where we need to go here. But the use of copper in target long-range shooting has now reached a standard where it's not just competitive, but in my view has an edge over conventional or current cup and core technology. The misstep that most people make is that they don't understand that to use a copper projectile to get these additional advantages is that you tend to need a faster twist barrel to stabilise and drive them. If you try and use these high quality superior performance products in a standard barrel, you don't get maximum performance. So those kind of issues need to be understood before you go down that path. But then ELR is a very specialist area anyway.
Yeah, and those guys are normally pretty across those things. You'd like to think that some of them.
Yeah, there's a wide variety of expertise out there.
Yeah.
And part of our role, of course, over the last few days and even now is to lift that level of awareness so that people are able to make better choices.
Yeah. All right. Well, we might, since you've mentioned it, we might get into those discussions about twist rate and stabilisation and things like that, because I know that's something that you're passionate about and it is very specific to your projectiles, but not even just your projectiles.
No, it's actually a universal principle.
Yeah.
And it's something that is not discussed universally, which is probably why there's a lot of people don't understand it. Some companies like Berger discuss twist rates quite a lot. We focus on it most extensively because we're trying to get people to make the right choices from the word go, rather than try half a dozen different options and see which one works best. Because they're a premium product, although they're quite price competitive. It's not at a level where you can afford to just flippantly buy a box that you don't use or doesn't work for you. And because it's new technology, I want people to have the best experience possible straight up so that they're not discouraged. If you're trying something new, it doesn't work for you, you tend to put it down and just dismiss it and forget it. And because a lot of what we're doing is at the cutting edge or the leading edge of the technology in this area, it's important to us that people understand the modifications or adaptations they need to make to get the best result without getting frustrated or upset.
Yeah. So specifically with your copper projectiles, in general, with a copper projectile versus a Leadcore projectile, to run in the same twist barrel, you're looking at running a slightly lighter copper projectile, correct, to stabilise?
Generally speaking, that's true.
Yeah.
Some of the new cartridges coming out have already got fairly fast twist rates, so you've got a little bit more flexibility there. But yes, look, in our range, we make everything from 22 through to 50, right? And our primary focus is meeting the needs of people with standard barrels already out there, right? We're not trying to say, use our bullets, but before you do, get rid of your current one and rebarrel your rifle, because that's just not going to work for anybody. So because copper is lighter than lead, without getting to the specific gravity numbers, the difference between a copper bullet and a jacketed lead bullet is roughly 20%. All right. So if you've got two bullets exactly the same shape and size and caliber and length and all the rest of it, exactly the same form factor, the jacketed lead bullet's going to be about 20% heavier. But it's not the weight that performs, it's the displacement in the hunting context, and it's the form factor that determines performance for target shooting. People talk about weight because it's easy to measure, but form factor is something that only the ballistician knows. And talking about that to the average shooter makes them glaze over because it's not something they can measure, verify, or otherwise, generally speaking, understand.
Yeah. So if if we're going to have a new, we've got a new rifle and we want to choose a projectile to reload, you've got some pretty key points that you look at yourself in your process, because you're trying to obviously, you're testing so much that you can't be mucking around with a million different things to find the right load. And something that I've been amazed with talking to you over the last couple of days is how quickly you can get close to that ballpark zone of a load that shoots in a specific rifle. What's your process to get there, to go, that's the projectile, that's the powder, that's what I want to run, and be in that zone? Short of you obviously offering up that advice to people that are buying your projectiles, just to people listening that want to know, well, how do I get into the ballpark? I don't even have any idea. What's your process for that?
Well, I think the ballpark starting point is, do you already have your rifle? If you've already got your rifle and your barrel has been ipso facto already selected, that becomes your starting reference point. If you haven't bought the rifle, then you can sit back and go, my objective is the reference point.
Whether that's a hunting objective or an ELR projectile,
whatever. And then you turn around and say, well, what's going to be the best performing product to meet that objective? Now I make the rifle match it. But if you've already got the rifle, then you go through the selection process of buying the best bullet for that particular setup that you already have. And it really just depends on where you're starting from. So at the end of the day, the first and most important thing is that the bullet and the barrel need to partner one another. And it's, in the same way that when you go and buy a motor car, it'll be set for either diesel, it'll either be a diesel or it'll be set for 98, 95 or 91 octane, right? And if you put a different fuel in it, you're going to get less than ideal results.
Yeah.
Right? So once you've bought the car, you're now committed to buying a certain grade of fuel, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And it's exactly the same for matching your bullet to your barrel.
Yeah. You've spoken about some of the online calculators, the Miller formula, and the different things you've used to find stability factors. Because for a lot of people, they simply don't know. They go, the box says I can run it in this twist or that way, and which you do also have those numbers on your website
and on the box.
And on the box, yeah.
So if you're at the shop and you pick it up and you go, well, this was designed for say in a 6.5.
Yep. 1 and 8,
whatever it is. The box will say for a 1 in 8 twist or a 1 in 7 twist or a 1 in 8.5 or what have you. Specifically trying to make it plain and clear that this bullet goes with that barrel or that rifle. For those who are wanting to do the reverse engineering before they buy the rifle, there's a program called the Miller Stability Formula. There's actually 3 of them, but there's only one that's ever commonly used, which has its plus and minuses. The plus is it's very simple and easy to use, but it only works in a static sense, and it doesn't really work very well for those that are engaging the transonic and subsonic zone in ELR. But that's a very, very small percentage of the market. For the guys that are going hunting or shooting at targets, generally speaking, of less than 1,000 metres, the fact that it doesn't work in the transonic zone doesn't really matter very much. And that's such a small percentage that you don't worry about it. But the Miller formula that's currently and commonly used on Accurate Shooter or on the Berger website is really good for calculating bullet stability for all but big hollow point and plastic ballistic tip bullets. If you're using the more conventional jacketed lead or copper bullets, that program works extremely well, but it underestimates the stability of plastic tip bullets. So you've got to be aware of that and be careful that you don't fall over some of the little tripwires.
And is that stability factor, are we looking for a specific number when we plug into this program of what's stable and what's not stable? And can you this was something that I was very curious about, can you over spin a bullet? Let's say the bullet doesn't come apart, but is there a point where over stabilizing the bullet, over spinning it, is giving you degrading effects on accuracy or long range ability? Like where does that all come into play? Because there's been that common I don't know if it's a myth or if there is some truth to it, that previously people are like, oh, you only want to spin the bullet just as much as you have to get it to stabilize. So people want to run the minimum twist they can to get that bullet to stabilize. Is there truth to that, or is there a reason that that's been the case?
There's, it's like all learning and development and research, there's an element of truth to it, but it's not the whole picture. And we're forever learning more. Basically, that idea came from the challenges of production of jacketed lead bullets. If you have a defect that's unobservable, such as a small air pocket, when you look at a jacketed lead bullet, you have a cup that's swaged, and then they drop a lead core into it, and then it's swaged again multiple times, and occasionally defects like little air pockets between the lead core and the jacket occur, and it's the equivalent of losing the wheel weight on your wheels as you're driving down the road. At 70 kilometres an hour, you don't notice any vibration. At 95 or 100 kilometres an hour, you don't notice any vibration. But at 80 kilometres an hour or 85 kilometres an hour, you really notice it, and it can be quite annoying and irritating. If you overstabilise a bullet in that context, you'd increase dispersion, in other words, lose accuracy.
Right, because those issues within the bullet are exposed because it's spinning it higher up. Yeah.
Now, can you overstabilise a well-made bullet depends entirely on your application perspective. An overstabilised bullet in ELR or extreme long range will influence the bullet's flight path as it's coming down off the apex of its flight curve. This is not generally something that most shooters are ever going to engage or worry about. But in ELR, you want it in a very narrow band. On God's little green earth, there's such a thing as too much and not enough of everything.
Yeah.
And if you want the bullet to turn into its flight path, you can never do it perfectly, but if as close as you can get to a very, very narrow stability band, which is is something that the average bloke can't sit down and work out unless he knows the form factor of the bullet. You either have to come back to the point where you trust the manufacturer that he knows what he's doing, or you just have to go, well, I don't know, because without the form factor of the bullet, you just can't work it out. And there's no formula that you can use without the form factor that's going to fix that. So in monolithic bullets, they do like to be spun faster because they're longer for their weight. And generally speaking, it's all but impossible to have anything other than a well-made bullet, because it's almost impossible to get an air pocket in it because it's a CNC turned off a copper bar. So you don't get those kind of defects. And the other thing is that coming off a CNC, you can change the shape of a bullet in a way that the swaging process of a jacketed lead bullet cannot, because we can do things that it's not that the fellas in the jacketed lead industry don't know. It's just that they can't do anything about it because you'd never get it out of the die, right? So there are pros and cons to each manufacturing process, and the pro for jacketed lead is that you can thump out thousands and thousands in an hour, whereas on a CNC machine they have to come off one at a time.
Yeah. So why has it been? It's quite commonplace now, from what I've seen, for these extreme long range shooters. I don't do any ELR myself, but I'm very interested in the sport. That there seems to be a caliber point where they move from using lead core bullets over to, okay, we're in the big girls now. We're 375 and up. We're running the full copper CNC lathe turned bullets. Why is it common there for them to do that in the bigger stuff and it's very acceptable, whereas you talk about running a copper projectile in your 6mm, even if it's your 6mm target rifle or your 6.5 target rifle, PRS rifle, whatever, or hunting. Why is it like people have this idea that then you don't go to the copper CNC projectiles until you're in the big stuff? Why is that, and what is holding people back from doing it in the smaller calibers that we're shooting more on a day-to-day basis and is a more common application?
Well, jacketed lead projectiles have been around for 150 years. It's certainly in common use for 120, 130, right? So you've got paradigms to overcome. You have issues of initially cost. Jacketed lead bullets are a cheaper product to make. However, the cost of the copper product is coming down and coming down and coming down. But the challenge is that the market is X size, and jacketed lead product, because of the rate of production, is easier to fill that demand very quickly. And the production capacity for copper is not there yet to replace it. So that's part of the equation. But the other thing is the distinct misunderstanding regarding the relationship between copper bullets and the twist rate. With the big girls, like the 375 Shaytac and above, gearing up the multiple swaging process for such small quantities is an extremely expensive process, and this is where the spinning it off a lathe is infinitely cheaper.
Yep.
The other thing too is that swaging really, really large bullets to very concise dimensions is much more challenging. When it comes to the smaller calibers, the copper projectiles can thoroughly outperform the jacketed lead product. But unless you match it to a much faster twist rate, it's not going to work. All right. And we're dealing with a marketplace which predominantly already has its barrels. Right. So putting a 140 grain copper projectile that will work exceptionally well in a 7-inch twist, but putting it into an 8-inch twist, which is the common standard, it's not going to work for you. So that's part of the problem, and it's a bit of an evolution thing, and I'm sure that in time that it'll end up going down that path. The market in Europe is already moving that way.
Yeah. To get around just for people listening, to get around the twist rate thing, it's not like you haven't made projectiles that only need to run in faster twitch.
No, heavens
you've done, and we can talk about this a little bit. Some of your projectiles that will stabilize in let's take the 6mm for example. Your 104, which is your currently highest BC projectile with 6mm, does need a faster twist that we're finding hard to 1 in 6. But you've got the 90 grainer coming out, which
works in 1 in 7.
Which works in 1 in 7s,
and the 1 in 7s are becoming more and more common every day
for that 6mm. Yeah,
and I'll give you a classic example of that evolution that's taking place. In the late 50s, when the 308 was first developed, it came out in a 1 in 14 twist. Very quickly went to a 1 in 13, all right? And then it went to 1 in 12. Now Europe commonly uses a 1 in 11, and America is generally using 1 in 10 for their 30 cals. So it's gone from 14 to 10 fairly quickly, right? And now Ruger is bringing them out in 1 in 9s, right? The 243, which at one stage you could only ever buy in a 10-inch twist, and we make bullets for them too. And they're the old traditional barrel twists, and more than 90% of our market. So we've got something to cover all of the ordinary day in, day out product consumption. Yeah. But you still have to be careful about matching the right bullet to the right barrel. But when you look at the 243 at one stage you could never buy in anything other than a 10-inch twist, there are now 7s out there coming from commercial rifle manufacturers. Yeah. This isn't custom stuff. Yeah. There are still a lot of 10s out there being made, and some are coming out in 9s and 8s. Yeah. but there are even some coming out now in 7.
Yeah.
And these are factory rifles,
Yeah.
not custom jobs.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit, since we're on that subject of like the weight of the projectile and stabilization and stuff. Let's talk a little bit about weight versus velocity. So if you're not governed by a speed restriction, like we are in PRS, where it's a little bit trickier because you have a speed restriction to if you're not governed by that, sometimes driving a slightly lighter projectile at higher speeds, which is what you're finding you're able to do with your projectiles, you're overcoming that need for having more mass sometimes.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about that. It's interesting.
There's a quaint saying that says velocity trumps BC. That's partially true. What it basically we've come up with a rough rule of thumb, which is pretty close. In fact, it's very close. That for every 100 feet of per second of velocity, the heavier bullet needs to be more than 5% higher in BC to equate. All right? So if you've got a bullet with, say, 7.5% increase in BC because of its weight and form factor and all the rest of it, but you're going 200 feet a second faster, you actually have an advantage with the velocity. Mm-hmm. But there's always a tipping point, and that point comes where more weight is going to bring you backwards because you're going to drop too much velocity. Now, BC is really important for high wind application and long range. Basically what people believe is that the wind pushes the bullet across, but that's not actually the case. What happens is a bullet works like a weather vane. It turns into the wind and then the spin drift takes over. Mm-hmm. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, but the challenge is spin drift is calculable and knowable and accessible.
Okay.
Right. Wind drift in its own, where you've got really poor BC, is going to widen your weapon employment zone, which is the American terminology for how much the wind is going to affect it and your hit rate. So it's important to get the BC as high as possible, but it's got to be partnered with velocity. And the best way to do that is to say, look, this particular bullet has this particular BC and it's going to be travelling at that velocity. Drop it into your program.
Yep.
Do exactly the same for any other bullet you choose to consider.
Yep.
As an option, and then turn around and say, well, which one's going to have the least wind drift and which one's going to shoot flatter depending on what your application is. I mean, a classic example, in range shooting, bullet drop's not important because it's known for a specific distance and the distance is known.
Yeah.
But in the hunting field, it could be anywhere between 250 and 400 metres. And if you're not familiar with that country, estimating the distance can be a little bit deceiving.
Yeah.
So flatter shooting is definitely an advantage.
Yeah.
But the other thing with the lighter bullets is it generates less recoil.
You're able to spot those shots exactly where they're going. And
you're able to see exactly what went on, but you're also, some people are more and less tolerant of recoil than others.
Yeah, and if you're talking specifically about long-range hunting, which I know you do a lot of, even though you've got a rangefinder and you're getting a reading and you've got your ballistics program, there's going to be variables within that. Whether your rangefinder bounced the rock in front of the long-range goat or, over the top of it, and having that little bit of extra velocity up your sleeve can help you in that situation. Sure.
Well, that's true, but there are other variables too that we know about but are very difficult to manage for, and that is multiple wind zones and things like that. And of course, if you're going to get into the long-range stuff and you're mucking around with measuring your air pressure, your temperature, your angle of the shot and all of those kind of things, but most of us are measuring the wind from our shooting position. But if you're shooting down a gully, the wind at the bottom of the gully could be going exactly the opposite direction. Yeah. And so a high BC and a high velocity helps
combat,
minimise those challenges.
Yeah.
A poor BC or a low velocity bullet is going to obviously be more affected.
Yeah. It's something I've heard you talk quite a bit about is when lighter is heavier, and that's in the hunting application. You've spoken about what happens to the bullet once it's inside the animal. Go into a little bit for us about what you're finding with the hunting application and the difference between Leadcore and copper projectiles.
Well, because of the historical application and production technologies of bullets for the last 130 odd years, everybody has referred to bullets or in their descriptor by caliber and weight. All right, and they're really easy terminologies to use. It's a 308. It's a 180 grainer. All right. This was all relevant when all bullets were made the same way, and it didn't matter whose you bought. They were, generally speaking, all cup and core, a gilding metal cup with a lead core. The alloys might have changed a little bit, and they might have been core bonded or otherwise, but generally speaking, they're all made the same way. So the reference point of caliber and weight compared to another when you were using the same descriptor kind of sort of made sense. But that all disappeared when the challenges of momentum were discovered. And the big issue became, how do we describe a bullet that holds together compared to one that doesn't? So we still talk about caliber and weight as though they were the defining factors, but they're not. They're contributing factors. When you have you can have a 220 grain cup and core bullet from a 308 completely disintegrate into tiny little fragments, and I even have some samples here to show, but they can completely disintegrate into tiny little fragments. What's its momentum? Because momentum is mass times velocity. If you've got no mass, your sectional density of the bullet sitting in the magazine
is not the same sectional density of the bullet that's inside the animal. Yeah.
And there's absolutely no correlation at all between the weight of the bullet when it started and the weight of the bullet when it finished.
Yeah.
The correlation exists mostly in the structure of the bullet. So if you go back to the old cup and core technology, if the traditional bullet was core bonded and maintained more of its mass, it still has no correlation to when it started, but it's a higher sectional density and it's a higher weight compared to the one that broke up. So depending on whether you're talking about big game or more commonly used cartridges here in Australia, a conventional jacketed lead bullet will disintegrate more than 75% of its mass on impact. All right, and that's okay in a sense in that it'll dump all its energy, but if it didn't reach the vitals,
it doesn't matter if it dumped energy if they weren't in there.
Because all you'll do is shock it and you'll drop it, and then it'll jump to its feet and run away. So you can have a 200 grainer that completely disintegrated. You can have one that was a full metal jacketed and completely zipped straight through and held all its mass. Or you can have one that fully expands and is going to lose a percentage of. And even a core bonded jacketed lead bullet in common conventional cartridges used in this country, you're going to lose about 25% of their weight. So if you've got a 200 grain core bonded projectile, it's going to be 150 grainer when it's doing its job, right? Because it lost 25% of its weight. And that's a pretty good average for most of the better quality core bonded bullets. Non-core bonded, they're going to do absolutely anything because it will depend on what it hits. If it slips between the ribs, it may not completely disintegrate, but if it hits a shoulder bone or if it's on a raking shot, it is going to disintegrate and it's not going to reach through. So your product selection there is really important. But when it comes to the monoliths, particularly our style as opposed to the first generation copper bullets, ours will completely expand, and 100 to 120% expansion is very common.
So you're getting a big wound channel. It's still expanding. It's still dumping energy. It's not penciling straight through like a full metal jacket. It's still
correct. and there are two aspects to that. Firstly, is it's maintained all its momentum because it hasn't shed any of its weight. The second one
Are you able to get 100% weight retention pretty much on most of your recovered projectiles?
We're generally speaking within 98%.
Yeah, wow.
Which is particularly our premium product. It has a little ball bearing tip in it, and that little ball bearing tip generally weighs, depending on which cartridge and caliber and all the rest of it, the most common one only weighs half a grain. So it's going to lose that half a grain, and you might lose another half grain in the little tip of the copper around it.
Yeah.
But it's not uncommon to recover a 150 grain projectile that weighs 148 or 149 projectile,
Wow.
149 grains on
In a nice,
recovery.
beautiful mushroom. That's
Yeah.
the thing.
But the other side of that equation is there when a bullet strikes an animal, there is both a temporary and a permanent wound channel. And that's a function of the square of the surface area on impact. So if you have a bullet that didn't expand, the square of that meat plate is not very big. If you have a bullet that expanded to 100% of the caliber, you've got this mighty mushroom, and the square of that expansion again is what produces the temporary wound cavity, and the permanent wound cavity will sort of vacuum back in on itself, but the damage has already been done, and the vitals, if it was a anywhere near reasonable shot, will have been destroyed.
Yeah, that's it's really interesting, and I, for one, with the hunting I've done and the culling I've been involved in, have been a big fan of high explosive bullets because they've worked in my application for what I've been doing specifically. But you said something the other day in a discussion we were having with another guy that actually really resonated with me, and that was to talk about sort of hunting discipline, I guess, as far as like I know what the bullets I've been using for the deer culling I've been doing have been working great, and pretty much all of the shots I've taken, well, nearly all the shots I've been taking, I've been very confident that I'm getting the bullet where I want it, and it's done its job and it's dropped the animal. But now I hadn't really thought about what would happen if that animal started quartering away from me. It was maybe the buck of a lifetime, and it was slightly less than ideal shot. Not that we want to encourage people. Not you always encourage ethical hunting first. That is 100% the way to go. But we're all human, and we've all made mistakes, or we've all thought a shot was, takeable better than it was, or you're excited and you think that that's a a beautiful shot when really maybe you weren't quite in the position you thought you were, or you maybe are involved in a culling situation and they're wanting you to drop an animal before it reaches a fence line or something. And what I found interesting was when you said to me, the monoliths with the way they penetrate and the way they retain energy and keep driving, it to a lesser degree, it buys you a little bit of freedom. I know the projectiles that I'm currently using for what I'm doing absolutely would not. If I had an animal, a deer quartering away from me, and I couldn't get it up into that chest cavity, and it came in the sort of, rear end of the animal or somewhere and had to penetrate a long way to find vitals, I know that I would be stuck. And so I just flat out wouldn't be able to take that shot.
But there are other things that pop up too, like unseen light foliage. Right?
Yakka bushes, they catch me out all the time.
And highly frangible bullets, which were designed to break up, do.
Yeah.
Now, if you're hunting one animal and you're fortunate enough to be able to work yourself into the position where you can take the perfect broadside and slip it between the ribs, an explosive or highly frangible bullet will sometimes produce some very spectacular drop-to-the-shot kills. It's not that they don't have a place. And they work particularly well on very lightly framed small game, dogs, cats, rabbits, hares, foxes, wallabies and kangaroos, and under the management programs, because they're very lightly framed, and you don't want anything to do anything other than explode inside, because it'll be an instantaneously humane
Lights out. Yeah.
Right. When it comes to the larger game, and there are some species of animals which just don't respond to shock. A big sambar stag won't respond to shock, other than very temporarily. Buffalo don't. All right, you must be able to reach through and smash the vitals. Now, the other thing too is, particularly in a culling situation, is that the first shot's, generally speaking, hopefully always perfect. But now you've lit the countryside up and everything else is running away, and those shots are not always perfect angles.
Yes.
Now, a fully expanded copper bullet that's opened up properly and maintained all its mass will still cut a straight path through to the vitals as long as you place the shot properly, and will produce that same humane outcome virtually from any angle. And we've pretty much proven that very consistently.
That straight wound channel is a massive thing. I know pretty much all of us that have hunted extensively have seen that, where you've shot an animal and then you've tried to, you're assessing things and you're trying to look for an exit wound, and it ends up in an area where you're kind of bewildered. You're like, how is my exit wound there? It should be here. Yeah. And you don't know, oh, maybe that's the entry, and you get all confused. Whereas you're saying that what you've seen with your projectiles, that it will generally keep its path, that it's sent on.
It's very unusual for it to divert very much at all. And why do jacketed lead bullets divert? Well, it's because they've become distorted on impact. And that distortion, particularly if it hits bone or gut punches on the way through, can distort in unpredictable ways and turn. And they do.
Yeah. You've mentioned that copper projectiles aren't all created equally, and there's a lot of copper projectiles out there now, but then definitely not all the same thing. I think it's something interesting for us to bring up, because my knowledge, what I thought was, I was always told that copper projectiles create more pressure in the chamber. So either you have to run, a lower charge, or you have to, work up more carefully. That's just sort of what I was told, or what I thought I knew. Now you have a process that you feel overcomes that, and your copper projectiles are going to load quite differently than maybe someone else's. Let's cover that topic a little bit so that people don't get confused with, heaping the outer edge projectiles in with every other copper projectile.
Well, I guess to give it a perspective, jacketed lead projectiles have been around for a long, long time, but they've still developed. And they've had 130 years plus to develop. Copper projectiles have been around over a much shorter period of time. And when they first came out, or first experimented with, whilst they were setting new standards in many ways, they shared a common root, in that in the very early lead bullets, which we called mini balls, were basically a ribbed bullet, a bit of a cone in the back, some of them flat point, some of them round nose, some of them hollow point. And the very early copper bullets were designed very, very similarly in appearance. They were ribbed. They were hollow point. They weren't coated. And those that package, although it was historically worked reasonably well, did generate much higher pressures.
Is that a pressure like in the barrel pressure, or is that a start pressure for that bullet to jump out of the case?
The shot, it's called SSIP, or shot start initiation pressure.
Yes.
Right. Now, a conventional or jacketed lead bullet has a shot start initiation pressure standard in the ballpark of 3,600 PSI. If you've got a really long shank, it's going to be higher. If you've got a very short shank, it's going to be lower. With the early copper projectiles, because they were longer and they were made in a particular way, they tended to be swaged into place and then turned. They were work hardened, and because they were very hard, there were two challenges. One is that they did increase pressures. They went up to about 6,000 PSI. Which is significantly higher.
So it's almost double the start pressure.
It was significantly higher than what people were used to. And if they just went on the weight scenario and put a 160 grainer when they used to use 160 grainer and put it in there without accommodating that, the pressures would spike. So another thing that was done in the very early days by the pioneer manufacturers was that they made them a little bit undersized. They fluffed about with different forms of coating. They put more or less ribs in it and cut these little pressure grooves out of it to get the pressures down. And it worked to a point, but that was very much first generation technology. And part of that bundle was that because it was work hardened and it had all these other issues, what tended to happen is you had to drive them really, really fast to get them to open up. Sometimes the pedals broke off, which brought you back to the diameter of the calibre in the first place, which reduced the frontal area and was less than ideal. And the other one was that if it wasn't travelling fast enough, it wouldn't open up at all because they were harder and more brittle. Second generation copper bullets now are quite different. They're not made undersized. They're made to SAMI and CIP specs for diameter. Most of the high quality stuff, whoever makes it, tends to be coated, which reduces the coefficient of friction. Gets the pressures right down to whatever standard they've been used to using with the jacketed lead bullets.
So your initial start pressure
is the same as a jacketed lead bullet that you're used to using.
Yeah. So your powder charge is going to match
very,
up with.
very similar.
Yep.
The only time that changes though is because copper bullets take up more space.
Yes.
Sometimes you have to use a slightly faster powder. So if you're used to using 2209, for instance, you might end up having to use 2208.
Yep.
Or if you're used to using 08, you might go to 06H.
Yeah.
But that's not universally true. That sometimes you can use exactly the same powder as well, and the load charge will often be very similar.
Yeah, right. What are you coating the projectiles with? What is it?
It's a proprietary product.
Yeah.
We don't use moly, and it looks like moly, and people sometimes withdraw from it because moly is a bit of a pain to clean out of your barrel.
Right.
We specifically don't use moly because there are corrosion implications and the fact that it's so difficult to clean out of your barrel and it can build up.
Yeah.
We use a proprietary product that doesn't do any of those things, and in fact, your cleaning regime is identical to what you're used to using.
Yeah, right.
And you can use exactly the same products to clean your rifle that you've always used, and you will find that it'll probably clean up a lot quicker.
Right.
And because of the friction modifying coating, you'll also see a significant reduction in barrel wear, particularly in the throat.
Yeah. Oh, that's super interesting. You just made a point about bullet expansion and reliable expansion. That's something I guess I forgot to touch on there, and that's a question I've got for you. What impact velocities to get a good expansion and get things to open up and sort of create that big temporary wound cavity? Are you at a point now where you're able to get these copper projectiles to open up under the same velocities that normal Leadcore projectiles do, or do they still need to be going faster when they get to the animal? Or
that's a really good question. We have a level of flexibility there that a jacketed lead bullet manufacturer would struggle with. We can make it open up or not open up to whatever standard we want to. The challenge becomes trying to preempt the intended target. Right, so on, for instance, the little 65 grain 243, it's very likely to be intended for use on light medium game. So you want it to open up but still penetrate. That's not going to work on a big heavy target. So I think the best example of that would be perhaps the 270. We have 110, 120 and 132 grainer. The 132 grainer was specifically intended to thump sambar, and it'll maintain all its weight, it'll penetrate, and it works exceptionally well. But if you turn around and use it on a fox and expect it to open up, it's going to do the job. It will open up, but it's a mismatch of intended. So I can get bullets to open up all the way down to 1,600 feet a second, and a lot of our 30 cal and 7mm stuff will do exactly the 6.5 will do that. It'll open up at 1,600 feet a second. But when it comes to something like the 338s or the big 300s, I can get them to open up at 1,600, but that tends to be for long range application because you want it to open up at the slower velocities because it's a long way out. If you happen to bump something at 50 metres though, and you're dead set determined that this is the Samber stag of the lifetime and he's jumped up in front of you and you want to take him, it has to be reliable enough to not just open up,
but to keep driving.
But to hold its mushroom together and not lose it. And that's an interesting challenge. It's something that you can only really do with copper.
Right.
Because I can smack something at extremely short range and, with the odd exception, keep the mushroom together. But you want it to open up at the longer distance
when the bullet's going slower,
and when the bullet's going a lot slower. And we've got a lot more flexibility. We can adjust things like the temper of the material
as it moves forward, so you can have
the temper is the toughness or the hardness,
right,
of the material. But the length of the hollow point, which is drilled, the graduation on the ogive will determine how quickly or slowly that will open up. And the other thing is that we call it the hinge, but the gap between the hollow point and the ogive is a very critical number, and how quickly that changes will determine how quickly the bullet opens up. And we can make it very tough. We can make it very easily expanded. But when we manufacture it, we've got to wind ourselves back and go, its intended purpose is what? So the 110 grainer in a 270 is absolutely awesome on all medium game. And the only reason we don't recommend it for Samber is because of the legal requirements where they're predominantly found, which is Victoria. And the minimum requirement of 130 grain goes back to when the standards were originally set 60 years ago, when copper bullets didn't even exist. So that's a bit of a historical anomaly. But the 132 grainer in our range for a 270 is a tougher bullet. Because it was intended for Samber, not foxes.
So this is all questions obviously people can ask you if they're looking at trying some of these out. They can easily email you and go, hey, you know what, this is my application. I want to shoot everything from this to this. I've got this caliber rifle, and you'll be able to get that data out to people, which is a service that, like, I know for myself, having, you know, it's not as easy for me to just contact Hornady or contact Burger and say I'm having these issues, or, you know, when are you going to have stock in this current day and age or whatever. Whereas to have a locally made product with access to you, and that access isn't just for me and the guys here, it's for the common, you know, the average consumer. They can get a hold of you, they can get emails, and you can get load data and things out to people, which is so advantageous because a lot of people don't have the knowledge that you have, or don't have the access to other people around to do this, and so
particularly in the regional areas.
They might just be starting reloading or been doing it for a while, but don't really have the, you know, the level to, you know, the knowledge to take it to the next level. So to have access to someone like yourself is
it's a
huge benefit.
That technical service is available to all customers. We don't sell direct, but if anybody has any technical issues, questions that they need to address or resolve, we're there to do exactly that. And generally speaking, we're able to do that for just about most people.
So get your outer edge projectiles through Projectile Warehouse, guys, because they make this possible. But, you know, if Rusty here can't answer the questions, I'm sure you can. And the price, we started talking about this last night. The price point is very competitive. I've got a bit of a sales background, so I sort of was like, all right, well, hit me with your numbers. What are we looking at here? And if you buy the 500 pack, obviously you're not going to do that to start with, because you're going to buy a smaller number to see if they work for what you want.
Do your development.
But once you get to your 500 packs, your cost, you're looking roughly pretty close, maybe slightly more, but hardly anything, around the mark of what your burger projectiles are. And now burgers are known in the industry as quite a premium product. So, and now Hornady's got things like the A-tip, which is for a target application, which is actually even more expensive than burger again, and a lot more expensive than your products. So if you're looking at premium products, which is what outer edge projectiles are, they're actually very competitively priced.
Correct.
It's the difference is when people go, oh yeah, but I can get this, this Hornady boat tail hollow point or this Hornady VMAX for this price or whatever. And it's like, well, you can, but we're not. You got to compare apples to apples. If you're talking the premium bullets, your burger long range hybrid targets, your Hornady A-tips, and your product.
Yeah.
When you go that level, they're the same price, if not better, than those products.
That is essentially true. And although we didn't set out to be the cheapest in that market segment, the issue was to remove price as an obstacle. All right, and the advantage that we have has been the fluctuation in the dollar and the freight costs from overseas. All of those things disappear for us, and we're able to be very, very competitive, particularly in the bulk packs on the target. People tend not to buy bulk packs in the hunting. Unless we do have a handful of professional colours, but the average hunter is not buying 500 packs. They're buying 1 or 2 boxes in one particular caliber application.
And if you're hunting, prize game, or you're trying to put meat on the table, and it matters to you, or that prize stag, of a lifetime comes along and it matters to you, the price of your projectile when you're hopefully just firing one into that animal, it shouldn't even be a factor. Like I look at price of projectiles because I shoot PRS. So I'm shooting a large number in practice and training and then competing. But for hunting, if I only hunted, I wouldn't really care what the price of that projectile was because I'm not using them as often.
Well, if you're out looking for that big trophy stag or buck or buffalo bull or whatever, you think that, I've spent hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to get there. There's the food and the time and the rates and all the rest of it that go with it. And you're quibbling over 50 cents for a bullet. It just doesn't make sense.
No.
If you're looking for a premium outcome because you're looking for that prize circumstance, that prize trophy, and the circumstances aren't ideal, you can have a higher level of confidence with our type of product. That you're going to go home with what you set out for, and to quibble over a few cents here or a few cents there when you've spent hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars to get there and home again, it just doesn't make sense.
No. Is there any disadvantages to copper monolithic projectiles? Is there obstacles to overcome? We've already talked about obviously the stabilization thing, so them being a longer projectile to equal the same weight, and sometimes you have to have the faster twist or come down a weight in projectile. Is there any other obstacles to overcome or situations where you wouldn't recommend someone go with a copper projectile?
Yeah, there are, and to be honest, if you're culling kangaroos in large number, the copper bullet scenario is not cost effective, but because they're designed to be tough and to penetrate, you're using if you're using smaller calibers like 22 and 6 mil on pigs and goats, it makes perfectly good sense. But when you're talking about wallabies and kangaroos, which sometimes need to be culled in big numbers, apart from the economic side of the equation, a tough penetrating bullet doesn't work on that style of animal because they're vertical, the pump is low, the lungs are up here, and you want something that's really explosive either on the head or in the heart lung. And a penetrating bullet is not the best option for that type of animal. But
it will still
it'll do the job. Don't get me wrong, it'll do the job. But you wouldn't take a Nissan Patrol to Le Mans, and you wouldn't take a Ferrari to haul your horse float.
Yeah.
Um,
But what is interesting is, so you've spoken specifically there about someone doing rue culling, so large numbers. But let's say your average hunter who might want to shoot, he might have access to cull some rues with permits or whatever on property. But on that same property, he might be wanting to shoot goats and pigs and maybe the occasional deer.
And that's when your option is you really must wind it back to what's going to be your most challenging circumstance.
Yes.
And that's when the copper projectiles come into their own, because they can cover absolutely everything. Whereas your frangible bullets are limited to certain types of game and shot.
Yeah, because you've got let's say you've got that lighter 22 or that lighter 6mm, which is perfect for the rue. Then suddenly a pig with a whole heap of mud baked on the side of him, presents himself. That projectile is not going to be ideal, whereas your projectile, he'll still take the rue down.
Straight away.
You're going to have a little bit more caution about what's behind the rue because you're going to have a bit more penetration coming out the other side. Yeah. But he's also going to be able to take the pig and the fallow with that same smaller, 6mm 22. A smaller caliber gun is going to be able to take slightly larger game because you're getting that penetration. You don't need
absolutely.
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, we might wrap that one up. But we're gonna get you on again. We're gonna keep diving into it because we haven't even started about your load development process and how to specifically load for copper projectiles and projectiles in general. Because I know you've got a very in-depth process about how you do that. So we're probably gonna get into that in the next one. But for an initial, mate, thank you so much for coming on and explaining monoliths and copper projectiles. So
my pleasure.
Anything else you want to add in there? But
not that can't be saved till next time.
Yeah, awesome, mate. All right, well, that was Steve from Outer Edge Projectiles, and once again, these podcasts are possible because of Projectile Warehouse and the facilities that they give us to be able to make these happen. So check those guys out. Check Outer Edge out. If you've got some Outer Edge projectiles and you're having trouble, or you want to know what to do with them, how to load them, shoot them, email.
Which one to choose.
Yeah, which one to choose. Yeah. Get in touch with Steve or the guys here at Projectile Warehouse, and I'm sure we can get those answers
sorted out for you.
Sorted out. So thanks, mate. Cheers.
Thank you.